Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. We're so glad today to welcome Nicky Wisener, who's one of the leaders of the managed access practice at the Clinigen Group, where we're going to be having a reflection on the last conversation with Matt Trudeau, the president of ITF Pharma here in the US. A lot of that last conversation was very much focused on how do we get approval and commercialize rare disease drugs, making sure that we're really bringing in the patient community and commercializing at the right time. But what we want to evolve the conversation to today is really focused on how do we drive access, and not just market access in the US, but access globally to the drugs that patients deserve and in any therapeutic area and any geography around the world. So, Nicky, thank you so much for joining today. Really excited to have you here.
No problem. Thank you very much, Kim. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. As we start out, maybe you can give us a little bit of your background. And in that, can you explain what managed access even means?
Sure. I'll try and keep it brief. It has we tend to talk managed access as an umbrella term, so I'll break that down, but try and keep it brief for you. So just in terms of background, I studied in epidemiology and moved into the pharmaceutical industry many moons ago. I've worked in large pharma and smaller pharma, but predominantly at a time when you had the big blockbuster cardiovascular drugs. So I worked in sales and marketing roles. And although that was a fantastic experience, I felt the need to get a little bit closer to the patient. So went looking for a role that actually did that for me. So it got me a little bit closer to the patients that were benefiting from treatments. And that's when I landed at IDIS, and that was about 17 years ago now. So worked for IDIS in the managed access space, which was then subsequently acquired by Clinigen. So I've been solely working in managed access, both in a commercial role and in operational roles for the last, almost 18 years now. And in terms of what we mean by managed access, and I always use the term managed access because it does get very, very complicated, but it is really an umbrella term. And what falls within that is lots of different country-specific terminology for enabling access prior to commercialization. So you might hear terminology like compassionate use, named patient. In France, there's a very specific AP/AC route. Lots of different countries have different terminology. And then we also find within the commercial environment, companies have different terminology that they use for this kind of access as well. But fundamentally, it is outside of the clinical trial setting and it's outside of the commercially launched setting. And it's that kind of gap in the middle, which enables patients strictly with unmet medical needs to access drugs.
That's amazing. And I think an area that, especially as we think about biotech leaders, everyone is eager and excited to take advantage of, but don't really understand or know how to do that in practice, especially given that a lot of the limited capital that biotechs have are focused 100% on getting patients into trials. And when we're talking about these high unmet medical needs in rare diseases in particular, there's very few patients globally to go around. So to provide access when you're not then putting them in the trial also creates a complexity. Can you talk a little bit about how do we balance that in these programs and or leverage these programs as a mechanism to get data that can really help these biotechs evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing, the important point is that this is it shouldn't cannibalize clinical trials, obviously. So this kind of access should really be where the patient doesn't meet the trial criteria, inclusion criteria, or where they potentially just geography doesn't mean that, means that they can't enter trials because of where the sites are located. So in no way should it cannibalize the clinical trial environment or the success of recruitment. But really where this comes into play is where a company, it might be a small company, it might be a very large company, has a drug that does fulfill or is deemed to fulfill some unmet medical need. And in those cases where there is that need, and nowadays there's an awareness of those products as well, it's a solution that means that companies can bridge that gap. And lots of different companies have lots of different objectives from why they want to achieve that. Equally, on the other side, we have companies that just deem the space as too complicated and then will kind of just not do anything. Right. And we completely appreciate that as well.
And in that situation where it's considered too complicated or they are trying to figure out how to get access, but it's more of an advocacy medical affairs effort. It's not really data generation. It's not really the commercial teams. How do these leaders think about developing these programs? And most importantly, when we think about these early stage executives, how do we think about funding these programs? Like, who is actually paying to treat these patients in these different scenarios? Where I think a lot of the connotation, for right or for wrong, is that if I'm going to run a compassionate use program or whatever you want to call it, I'm just giving away free drug around the world and I don't really get a benefit, but it's, ethically the right thing to do. So how do we balance that and balance the economics to make the business case for this?
No, yeah, understood. And I think there's a couple of questions there. I think the first question in terms of, the leaders within the organizations, and this is where the smaller organizations really benefit, because the thing about managed access is that it touches clinical teams, it touches medical teams, it very much touches commercial teams. Large organizations are so siloed that it can be very hard to bridge those parts of the organization. But in the smaller organizations, it's a fantastic opportunity for everybody to really look and plan this so it meets everybody's objectives and those of the patient. So that's the first thing. It's a great opportunity to do it in a way that has a long-term view and not just kind of focused on the clinical outcomes or the data, but very much about how that might impact commercialization. I think a second point there more about funding, and that's a really important question. Managed access programs can be run at different times in the product lifecycle. So really anything up to phase 3. So where the drug is potentially globally unlicensed. So that's one part. They can also be run when there is a launch somewhere. So after phase 3, after commercialization, you might have a US launch, but you're interested in different markets. And again, even on the very, very late stage of the product lifecycle, where there's potentially withdrawals, again, the mechanisms and the legislation can be used to enable access where the drug is not commercially available. So there's lots of different opportunities along the product lifecycle. It shouldn't just be seen in one space. But I think that when the product is globally unlicensed, it's more difficult to charge for the medication in this legislation, through the legislation. It is possible. Obviously, the US is extremely challenging, but other markets around the world are less challenging and actually almost appreciate that some of these companies with the very innovative drugs do need to recoup potentially costs of enabling access globally. So different stages of the life cycle legislation, regulators will look at it differently. Certainly once a company has, let's say, for the sake of argument, a US launch but hasn't launched anywhere else, I think the recognition then that the product would be charged for is much more accepted. So it can be that there is a charge associated and that payers will consider that in various different countries in Europe and the rest of the world. So it depends really where the product is in the life cycle, which will tell you how difficult it is to kind of have reimbursement. But it is absolutely possible. So it shouldn't be something that completely puts the companies off. But also you need to look at the big picture as well, because a company may decide that it should be provided free of charge through compassionate use or whatever the mechanism might be in that specific country. But also longer term, how would that impact the commercialization of the product? So, okay, maybe, the longer term gain is that it's a free of charge provision of medicine for patients that need it. But actually with the experience, hands-on experience that those physicians are getting throughout that period of use, it might mean that the commercialization is much quicker. And then there could be potentially a financial impact there as well, a positive financial impact at that end of the process.
Absolutely. So different strategic levers that they might pull depending on what the objectives are. The objectives might be to get it to as many patients globally as possible, as quickly as possible. Yeah. It might be to collect data from those places. It might be a training ground for physicians on the therapeutic area, the modality, whatever it might be. But they are it sounds like these programs are incredibly bespoke based off the strategic objectives of the organization and macro, how they envision their launch, which could be 5 years from now, but how they're thinking about the life cycle of their launch planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And these programs don't sit in isolation in one of those buckets. They obviously, they usually go through the whole product life cycle. So it might be that you start access when the product is in phase 3. Occasionally, with the way that the regulations are going, it could be earlier, but usually it's around phase 3, and that will run alongside clinical trials, alongside commercialization, and right the way through until your final launch market is launched. So it should be looked at as a continuum, and along that stage, you may have free of charge drug, you may have a milestone where it becomes charged for, you may switch to a commercial pack, which changes the legislation. lots of things you can do within that environment.
Amazing. And within that, Nicky, can you give us a little bit of an overview of where and how this sits within a traditional biotech organization? And what I mean by that is I can envision in a large pharma or classical, like larger organization, there's probably entire teams specifically focused on what do these programs look like? When are we doing them? How are we optimizing across our portfolio? And the work probably ebbs and flows across the 20 different products that they're thinking about. But when we think about a single or dual asset biotech company where everything is living and breathing by those assets, we have a very limited team that's very much, a chief medical officer, head of clinical development. You probably have a safety team. You may or may not have a head of med affairs yet, depending on your stage. We're thinking about these incredibly lean teams. For lack of a better way of asking the question, whose problem is this to own? Who is really thinking about this and living and breathing the question when, it could be a chief commercial officer, but if you're in phase 1, you don't have a chief commercial officer at the table yet. So where and how does this fit within how a biotech is established and who owns that issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And unfortunately, it does vary company by company, as you say, is the kind of where they're sitting along that life cycle. I think just to flip back to big pharma, that and the challenges they have and how that kind of is completely the opposite and why it's more positive for the sort of smaller biotech company is that these programs can be run alongside clinical trials, as I mentioned, but they also can provide access to patients that come out of clinical trials. So we call them post-trial access programs. They're still within the managed access program legislation. But in a big pharma company, you've got a completely different team that's managing patients exiting an OLE, for example, and coming into this managed access program. A completely different team then to pick that up when it's, phase 3 moving into commercialization. You've got a market access team. And these teams are not connecting at all. So you're running very siloed programs, potentially with the same healthcare professionals. And each one has a different objective and there's no holistic kind of oversight, which is a shame and can have its own challenges. In the smaller emerging biotech area, it's actually much better because people talk. And who owns it is really challenging. It's probably still medical to a certain extent, but I think that most of the companies that we work with, which are more phase 3 onwards, it is the commercial groups are much, much more involved. And I think that's the biggest contrast to when you look at the big pharma companies. The commercial element in the smaller companies is recognized very, very quickly. And whereas the primary objective is always about getting drug to patients that need it the most, the commercial objective does play a much bigger part with those companies. And they don't shy away from that because I think that's a very important part of the discussion and part of the communication, especially if there's a funding requirement to enable this access. So it might feel like it's more difficult, or it might feel like we shy away from how can we have compassionate use in the same conversation as a commercial launch, but it's actually much, much better to do that at the beginning. And I think that's the great thing about the biotech, emerging biotech space and the commercial element that does tend to have more ownership there.
It's such an interesting point and one that aligns really well with a lot of conversations we've had on prior episodes of this podcast and that SSI has frequently with our client organizations, which is we need to do drug development with the end in mind. And what that means is we need a commercial voice as early as designing your phase 1 and thinking about your core TPP for where the entire asset is going to go. And it doesn't mean you need to hire a chief commercial officer, but you need some of that thinking up front because it can help lay out the integrated evidence plan. And a lot of people in the industry are not talking about IDPs being kind of the hot thing that everyone's looking to build. But I do think the concept of an IDP or these fully integrated evidence strategies that start with your TPP in phase 1 and really go through the life cycle provide an opportunity for people and these smaller organizations to think a little bit more critically about everything that you've just described, which is like, how do we get innovative ideas and innovative ways to get patient on board?
Yeah. And I think that can be, the challenges then in a smaller or emerging biotech is potentially, and again, just using one example, they could just be very much rooted in the US. So, the thought of enabling access into all the different European countries, which all have different legislation, and then you've got rest of the world, can be enough for a company just to say, no, it's too risky, Absolutely. So, and obviously that's why we partner with companies as Clinigen. But really, I think the important thing is that it can be seen completely differently. So yes, it might look a bit challenging, but it actually isn't. You just have to know what the legislation is. And what it does do on the flip side of it is it enables early conversations with regulators with healthcare professionals, potentially with patient advocacy groups. And that can really, really support the progression of the company towards the commercialization. So it's kind of, I guess my message is don't be put off. It's very easy to do, but it's not that difficult to navigate.
Amazing. Not that difficult to navigate if you know the parameters by which you're navigating, which sounds like the operative piece.
Absolutely. But if you very much have an objective in mind, or whether that's data, whether that's real world data that you would gain from these programs, or whether it is about launch, or whether it's a particular subset of patients, whatever it might be, then that can be built into the design of the programs and communicated actually with the regulators. I think that's the nice thing we sometimes forget, is that in many countries, the regulators form a important part in the decision-making process to enable access prior to commercialization. And they also are very, in lots of countries, very open to dialogue with companies at this stage, which is fantastic in terms of building future relationships.
I can absolutely see that. And I imagine one of the hardest challenges for really implementing a managed access program is something that we see all the time, which is that even in small emerging biotechs, there's inherently silos that come with everybody going heads down with the function or the demands of their day job. And so this fundamentally, in the same way when we think about like program leadership and connecting dots and breaking down silos being what's really going to drive an outcome for a biotech or a value inflection point for an exit or whatever they're going for, it sounds like this is the exact same, where in order to do managed access correctly, you need to be okay with dropping your flag or your silo or your functional ownership and saying, what's absolutely best for this program, for this asset, and for these patients. And let's figure out how everybody gets something beneficial out of it. But you're talking ClinDev, you're talking about real world evidence, you're talking about commercialization, you're talking about med affairs. There's a lot of different stakeholders at play, and it's hard to wrangle, even in a small organization, a lot of those people at the same table.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes back, your points and just go back to when you're planning the clinical trial. It is again about planning with end in mind. And it's exactly the same in the managed access space. And having those key players having a voice is absolutely vital, because you don't want to run a program, potentially capture real world data with that, and then the real world data, information, evidence that you have doesn't actually go anywhere to support your commercialization or your future kind of development of the product.
Exactly. One question I have for you, Nicky, as we think about these programs, are there certain therapeutic areas, modalities, et cetera, that lend themselves better or worse to these kinds of programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the key thing to remember with these programs is they are designed for patients with unmet medical needs. So, clearly, the big, as we mentioned it before, but sort of the big kind of cardiovascular disease type areas where there's lots of other products on the market, very successful, is probably not the area that we're looking at. There is some exceptions to that when you've got patients coming out of clinical trials. That's the only kind of real exception. But the legislation is written in a way that enables healthcare professionals to, in consultation with their patients, make a very balanced judgment about whether this product, which is not commercially available in their country, is the right one for them. And therefore, it is very much restricted tends to be rare diseases where there's not obviously lots of treatment choices. Oncology, neurology, infectious disease, they're the kind of typical areas that we see, where either there's, the patients have either been through a whole horde of drugs and they've got to the stage where they've pretty much tried everything, or simply the rare diseases where there just is nothing, and it can be anything along that spectrum. On the flip side of it as well, you could be in a situation where you have a product that's potentially maybe off-label, but actually it's a tablet and the patient can't swallow a tablet, it's a child. So it could be something like that, quite nuanced as well, but usually it's within those kind of specific disease areas.
Amazing. So any kind of rare disease, oncology, hard to treat, anything along those lines, which really is a huge portion of the biotech industry. That's really what biotech has always been about, which is about really innovating for patients that otherwise don't have, I would say, like the commercial firepower to necessitate, big innovation from a Pfizer, but not to pick on Pfizer. They're all doing fantastic work, but it's not as commercially viable to do innovation in that space. And biotech is really filling that gap in the industry. And so it sounds like this is an avenue that more biotechs should be thinking strategically about taking advantage of, but maybe hasn't felt as accessible, to play on the word, but doesn't feel as accessible to biotech leaders as it maybe should. And so there's a little bit of a bridge to play in making it more digestible and easier for them to consider the value of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be something that's always considered, at least. And I think a lot of companies actually just bypass it because, as you've rightly said, there's so much that, they're focusing on getting to that. I think Matt called it chapter 2. And, how do we get there to that approval and then onward into the commercialization space? But actually, if this just always is a piece that's considered in the rare disease area, all companies really should be looking at it and making balanced judgments about whether it's applicable or not. And clearly, this only works if there's patient demand. So if, there's any patient demand for the product, because it is based on a reactive approach rather than being very proactive, it's not a sales kind of environment. So there needs to be an expectation for a level of demand of the product, but in many of those disease areas that there will be. And then in those cases, it should always be considered. And it might be a decision that it doesn't go ahead for various reasons, but it should always be considered. I think that's the message.
Absolutely. Nicky, this has been an amazing overview. I definitely took away a number of nuggets, but most importantly, that managed access is an option for smaller biotechs. And not only is it an option, it can be a strategic advantage as you think about the potential market dynamics, commercialization 5-10 years down the line, whenever it might be, but to really think about it strategically from phase 1 and think about how do we move all the parts or put the parts in place to maybe potentially take advantage and make sure as many patients as possible get access to your medication. So thank you so much for the great conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.